Hey, today we're going to talk about 8.2, Human Impacts on Ecosystems. So take a moment, check out the Enduring Understanding, look at the learning objective, pause the video, squint your eyes, and check out the essential knowledge as you set up your Cornell notes. Okay, so this is some of this will be a review, some of this is new information, but there's a lot of information according to the course and exam description, so just bear with me as I go through these points. So just to review, we have a range of tolerance, and the range of tolerance is basically instead of saying something like, oh, it can be harmful to an organism, or the organism will not be healthy. Like, that's not something you want to say. You really want to talk about the range of tolerance and whether the environmental conditions fall within that organism's range of tolerance or outside of that range of tolerance. So when bad things happen or when the environmental conditions change to a certain degree, don't say the organisms become harmed. Say that they are experiencing physiological stress. That is a better way of using your vocabulary and giving AP quality writing. So physiological stress, this is when we're in the yellow zone. This is actually in the red zone. We got death. But physiological stress can result in limited growth, reduced reproduction, difficulty breathing, asphyxiation, which is kind of like suffocating, well, it's lack of oxygen, and hormonal disruption. So these are examples of physiological stressors, and you could use the word or use the term physiological stress or be more specific. So one ecosystem that is really discussed a lot, and especially during this unit on water pollution, are coral reefs. And recall that coral reefs have huge amounts of biodiversity. This was taken by me on spring break. This was a coral reef off of the coast of Belize, and it was amazing. We got some rays. We got like a little, I think that's like a dory type fish, whatever they're called, the blue, I don't know if it's an angel or something. And we also have a manatee, and manatees are giant mammals that are huge, but I was so close I had to move away from this one. Anyway, I highly recommend going scuba diving if you can. But to talk about corals, we have, just to review, we have a symbiotic relationship in coral between the coral, which is an animal, that's the polyp, and these little tiny little white dots on here are all of the coral polyps, and you can kind of see their little tentacles coming out, and then they can retract. But they also have algae that live inside of their bodies, and the algae are performing photosynthesis, and that algae in the photosynthesis obtains or produces glucose, which the coral polyp will use as a source of food. And also, a calcium carbonate shell is excreted by the polyp, and that protects both the polyp and the algae. And this calcium carbonate is limestone. And over many, many years, the buildup of this coral and all other organisms with calcium carbonate shells under pressure and heat can create limestone. But it still is predominantly composed of calcium carbonate. So coral reefs are very unique in that they have a relatively narrow range of tolerance. They do not have a wide range of tolerance. They have a narrow range of tolerance. And these are all examples of different corals. This is a brain coral. Just looks like a brain. But one thing that happens is a phenomenon called coral bleaching. And it sounds exactly like it is, like where the corals start losing their color. And this happens because of global warming predominantly and ocean acidification. We'll talk about ocean acidification in another lesson, but basically adding too much carbon dioxide to the water produces a lot of carbonic acid. That's acidification. Both of them are from greenhouse gas emissions, predominantly carbon dioxide. So when coral bleach, what happens is the coral expel the algae. The algae are very sensitive. Coral are very sensitive. It just takes one little thing and all of a sudden it's like, done, I'm out. The algae leave. And once the algae are expelled, the coral will lose their color, but they will, because the algae provide the color, but they will also lose their source of food. So eventually the coral will die, and disrupting the entire food web. Remember, there is huge biodiversity in coral reefs, so if we are disrupting a food web, we are leading to biodiversity loss, which is a bad thing. So other things that can damage a coral reef is we can have sediment pollution, which is from runoff, and it can impact photosynthesis because if we have too much sediment, it can block out the sun and it can impact the photosynthesis of these the algae within the coral polyps. Other destructive practices, fishing, especially the bottom trawling fishing. That's when they drag the net or the something like a bucket. They're scraping something on the bottom just to kind of pick up all of these benthic organisms. That can disrupt the coral. But also any recreational activities, whether you're boating, scuba diving. Like we were instructed when we went scuba diving, or snorkeling, I guess. We were instructed not to touch the coral because the coral are hypersensitive and we don't want them to expel that algae, which could lead to their death. So another thing that can happen in aquatic ecosystems is an oil spill. And we have two examples of oil spills. We have the Deepwater Horizon, which was in 2010, and that's basically was an offshore oil rig. And it was on fire for many, many days, like weeks. And also the Exxon Valdez was in the Arctic up by Alaska, and it ruptured, the ship ruptured and leaked out 20 million gallons. I don't know exactly how many it was. It was a lot. But these hydrocarbons are toxic. They're toxic because the hydrocarbon concentration, organisms cannot survive with hydrocarbons that are too high. Hydrocarbons are what's present in crude oil. Remember, there's different types, and a hydrocarbon just means there's hydrogen and carbon. Like ethane, propane, methane, all of those are hydrocarbons, and there's many of them present in crude oil. So they're toxic because they could limit the growth, they can impact respiration. They impact respiration because they may, for example, the hydrocarbons, the oil may coat the gills of fish. It may impact reproduction, and also it can lead to asphyxiation, especially with this blocking of the gills. And any floating crude oil will coat the feathers or the feathers of birds and fur of marine mammals. So that can also impact their ability to move around. It may impact a bird's ability to fly. It may impact an organism's ability to feed or to escape a predator. So methods of cleaning up an oil spill. You can have a physical method. You see here they're using shovels. They're scooping up the oil. Maybe there's oil-soaked rocks. Scooping that up. You could use a vacuum, which is physically removing it. Remember that oil floats on water, so this is a good thing. And you can use these little like, they're kind of like pool noodles, and they make them into a U shape, and they're kind of corralling the oil and collecting the oil, and then they can siphon it up or vacuum it up and dispose of it properly. You can use chemical methods. One chemical method is using a chemical dispersant, which basically you add it to the oil kind of like breaks up into smaller pieces, and then will eventually settle to the bottom. Now this is a problem because there may be benthic organisms at the bottom of the ocean that may be impacted or negatively impacted by this oil. However, out of sight, out of mind, that seems to be our motto. So this is not necessarily the best method, but in some situations this may be the only option. And another chemical method would be to use like soap. You've probably seen these commercials with the little ducks getting soaked with oil. Well, soap will naturally or chemically and naturally remove the oil by bonding with the oil. Without going into the chemistry of it, it is a chemical treatment. And finally, biological methods. You could have bacteria or algae, certain types of protists that can chemically and physically break down the oil into other less harmful or harmless products. Now, this is not something that is an active, like large-scale use. However, the technology or there has been lots of research done on this. There is a potential problem because if you have this could be used as a weapon, because one of the biggest products in this entire planet is oil, and there's a lot of money in oil, and a lot of wars have been fought over oil. So one thing that could be a sort of weapon, or if you weaponize this bacteria, it could cause lots of problems between different countries. But that's not really a necessary... it could get into gas tanks. There are, potentials, and these are just potentials. These are not actual real threats. Now, solid waste pollution, or litter as you probably know it, but solid waste pollution can be in water, it can be on land. Besides it being ugly, here's some examples. We have plastic waste, and this is an example of plastic waste. Old tires, wrappers, opening something up and throwing it on the ground, that's littering. If you have littering, it's considered solid waste pollution. But some non-examples, if you have organic waste, like for example the runoff from a manure lagoon outside of a feedlot, fertilizers from lawn or agricultural fields, toxic waste from a chemical plant, radioactive waste from a nuclear power plant, these are not examples of solid waste, mostly because they're not really solid. Okay? All right, so some impacts of solid waste pollution. Plastic can asphyxiate marine organisms. In other words, you've seen probably a picture of like a turtle, and then you have the six-pack ring from soda cans. They may get around their neck, and it may impact their breathing. If you have certain organisms that eat the plastic and it gets stuck in their nasal passages, or if it gets stuck somewhere where they cannot access their lungs, that is also a problem. Can lead to asphyxiation and an organism's inability to get enough oxygen. It can also impact their digestion. So one thing is, a plastic bag, when it goes into the ocean, even if you have a plastic bag that's like green or red, eventually they can become bleached by the sun and lose their color. So they look kind of transparent, and they look like jellyfish. And some turtles eat jellyfish, some fish eat jellyfish, and if they eat this plastic bag, they're not able to digest it, and it will sit in their intestinal tract, and it can interfere with digestion, and it can eventually, if they don't pass it through, it can sit in their gut indefinitely. And there have been cases of opening up a fish, opening up different sea mammals, and seeing them when they wash up on shore, you open their stomach, and you just see lots of ocean plastic. This is a problem. You could have medical waste. So if you have medical waste, if you have needles, it may transmit diseases. Biohazardous waste is anything that is from a human tissue that could potentially infect another human. So that is a problem. And finally, another solid waste pollutant is ash from a coal-fired power plant. Coal-fired power plants, the ash release mercury, and the mercury is not really a problem, but when it gets into an aquatic environment, the bacteria in the water convert it to methylmercury, which is very, very toxic. And methylmercury can accumulate in organisms and contribute to neurological damage. And finally, you can have coal ash leachate from landfills. You can have if you burn coal, you have the ash, you put that in the landfill. Well, eventually, if it gets wet, and some of that liquid can pull with it some of the other pollutants, and it can leach out of the landfill and spread and impact the groundwater, which is a problem. All right, sediment pollution is just like it sounds. Anytime you have this sediment, basically high turbidity, low water clarity. So sediment pollution can be caused by construction site, building up dust from cutting wood, cutting rocks, creating a lot of dust that can make its way into a waterway. From monoculture, when you're growing one crop, and from monoculturing or monocropping, they could be harvested at the same time, which means a lot of sediment can come off of the field if there's a rain event, and that can go into a body of water, and it is contributing to sediment pollution. Tilling or plowing is breaking up the soil. When you break up the soil, you're generating a lot of dust. That dust can run off into the water. Also highway runoff. And the highway runoff from a roadway can contribute to buildup of undissolved particles in a body of water. So some of the impacts, they can clog the gills of a fish, impacting the fish's ability to take oxygen out of the water. Can also block the vision of a predator. If you can't see your prey, you're not going to be able to catch it. You're not going to eat. You can also block the sunlight and decrease photosynthesis rates, which can impact the primary productivity and overall food webs of an aquatic ecosystem. And finally, if there are nutrients or organic materials present in the sediment, it can contribute to eutrophication, which is, eutrophication leading to an algal bloom, leading to hypoxia, and then biodiversity loss. Okay, so in aquatic ecosystems, we have oxygen. And remember that warm water holds less oxygen, cold water holds more oxygen. So that's something that is independent of what we are discussing here. So now we're talking about dissolved oxygen in a water, and this distance would be like, for example, in a river. This would be the distance downstream. So it can be feet, it can be miles, it could be whatever. But what happens, along with the dissolved oxygen, this is the amount that we have available, and then we have the biological oxygen demand. And this is how much is basically needed by the organisms, all the fish, all of the macroinvertebrates, all of the organisms that are living in the water and are obtaining the oxygen directly from the water, from the dissolved oxygen. So dissolved oxygen, you'll see it written as DO, and you'll see biological oxygen demand as BOD. So the DO has to be above the demand. You need the supply to be above the demand, or else you're going to have a problem. Now, if you have in your ecosystem organic waste, now my demand for oxygen, this 0 refers to the location of where the organic waste was released. Once we release organic waste, all of a sudden the demand for that oxygen shoots up. And that's because the bacteria and the microorganisms are using that organic material as a food source, and a lot of respiration, decomposition is occurring. They're consuming all of the oxygen, not all, but they're consuming a large portion of the oxygen in this body of water. And then over time, that demand is going to go down because the organic material, the food source, will be consumed. And then eventually there's also mixing of, atmospheric oxygen is also mixing into the water, and there may be photosynthesis occurring from plants. So basically you're adding more oxygen to that water, or you're getting far enough away from the source that basically all of that organic waste has been consumed. Now, right here we have the demand, or the supply of the oxygen. So right here where we had this waste, now the supply went down because it's all of the oxygen, there's a huge demand for it. So the oxygen is being consumed, the supply of oxygen goes down, and then eventually it will recover. And this is called the oxygen sag curve. The sag curve occurs because, again, bacteria are consuming all of the organic waste, and then eventually the oxygen will replenish itself, either from the atmosphere, from photosynthesis, and also basically just mixing around with other areas that have less organic waste present. So these little graphs, this shows as the distance from a waste, or as the distance from the waste increases, the dissolved oxygen will also increase. So in other words, eventually this should get back to normal. There will be that initial sag, and that's because of the consuming all of the organic waste by the bacteria. And another thing I want to show you is the distance from a organic waste spill. The organic content will also decrease. So the oxygen will increase as we move away from a spill, and organic content will decrease as we move away from a spill. And when I say spill, I mean an organic waste spill. It doesn't just have to be, a little turd. It could be any sort of like organic material from, whether it's runoff from an agricultural field, anything to that effect. So this is called hypoxia, and hypo just means underneath. So hypo, like a hypodermic needle, goes under your skin. That's a needle you get a shot with. Because it is underneath the demand, this area is hypoxia. So I've used that word hypoxia a lot during this year, and this is actually what it looks like on a graph. We have dead zones, oceanic dead zones around the planet, and that is because of all of these hypoxic areas. This is a basic graph. We have some areas in the Pacific Northwest, but basically all around the Gulf of Mexico, there's dead zones. And that's because of the organic waste that comes from agriculture and manufacturing. And all along the east coast of the United States, we also have hypoxic areas. Northern Europe is very hypoxic. You have areas of Japan. So in other words, a lot of these areas have high population densities, and these high population densities, humans don't really know how to take care of our stuff, so that's a problem. Anyway, we could also use indicators, and macroinvertebrate indicators are macroinvertebrates are large invertebrates. A lot of them are either like shellfish, crustaceans, and a lot of insect larvae. So we have some that are pollution sensitive. So they have a very narrow range of tolerance. If you see these organisms, I think this is a caddisfly larva. This is pollution sensitive. If you see this organism, this water is clean. Because this, whatever you're looking for, if you're looking for dissolved oxygen, if you're looking for turbidity, if you're looking for dissolved, if you're looking for particular nutrients, it's within this range. This organism is happy. So it is very little, if any, pollution. Now, when you have an organism that is somewhat pollution tolerant, they have a little bit wider range of tolerance. So they can live somewhere where there's going to be maybe more turbidity. And typically, if we had these organisms, they're probably not going to be living together, because the pollution sensitive organisms are pretty good at living in this area. So if you have one of these that's somewhat pollution tolerant, chances are it's going to be somewhere in one of these areas, not necessarily in the middle, because then you would have other organisms that are living there. And finally, you'll have ones that are strictly pollution tolerant. So they will live in either the really dirty areas or the areas with low dissolved oxygen, maybe it's temperature extremes. But they have a much wider range of tolerance, so they can survive in a variety of conditions. And again, when you have pollution tolerant, they're only competing with organisms pretty much of the same species. So the diversity that you will find in pollution tolerant areas is a lot lower than in areas that are not polluted. And we're going to do an activity like this in class, so you'll get to hands-on practice this. So, for FRQ practice, I would like you to explain how humans have impacted the biodiversity of coastal marine ecosystems. Hint, hint, coral reef. There was a lot of information. I hope that this was informative. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you soon.